Out of first class, old lady. The words sliced through the quiet of the first-class cabin, sharp and humiliating. They came from Laura Bennett, the chief flight attendant, her tone dripping with condescension as she stood over a 75-year-old woman in a gold-trimmed African boubou. Passengers froze. Some lowered their eyes. Others raised their phones, sensing that something ugly and unforgettable was unfolding before them. Grace Johnson didn't flinch. She set her leather bag carefully on her lap, adjusted the folds of her head wrap, and lifted her eyes with calm precision. "This is my seat," she said softly. Her voice was composed, but it carried weight. The silence after it was louder than Laura's insult. Whispers stirred. Cameras kept rolling. A young passenger muttered, "Why are they treating her like this?" Another voice hissed, "She doesn't look like she belongs in first class." What none of them knew was the secret tucked inside Grace's bag. The truth that would flip the entire cabin upside down and leave an airline scrambling. Who exactly was this woman they tried to push aside? And what power did she hold that could silence the whole system? Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Tap subscribe, join the community, and let's begin the story. The announcement had barely faded when the confrontation began. "Ma'am, I need you to move. This section is reserved for premium passengers." The voice belonged to Laura Bennett, chief flight attendant. Her tone sliced through the engine's hum and the shuffle of coats. First-class passengers looked up from champagne flutes and glossy magazines. Grace Johnson didn't flinch. At 75, her back remained straight. Her chin lifted with the poise of decades spent in boardrooms and summits. She wore a deep blue boubou trimmed with gold embroidery, her silver curls wrapped in a matching headpiece. In her lap rested a small leather handbag, softened by years of use. "This is my seat, first class. 2A, Grace said calmly. Laura's lips tightened into a half smirk. "I think there's been a mistake. We don't often see passengers dressed like—" She stopped, too late. A young man behind her angled his phone, recording. Grace slid her boarding pass from her bag. The paper trembled only slightly in the engine's vibration. Laura examined it like counterfeit, then tapped her tablet. "Our system shows you in economy, row 31, middle seat." "I purchased this seat weeks ago," Grace replied evenly. "Then step aside until we resolve this." Laura pitched her words loud enough to shame. Murmurs spread. A woman in 3C whispered, "She's so elegant. Why treat her like that?" A college student lifted his phone higher. Grace folded her hands neatly. "I will not step aside. I am exactly where my ticket says I belong." Laura's nostrils flared. She leaned closer, lowering her voice while making sure others still heard. "Listen, ma'am. These seats are for a certain level of passenger. Mistakes happen online. I'm trying to save you embarrassment." The insult landed. From across the aisle, a man in a blazer muttered, "Maybe she should just move so we can leave on time." "Exactly," Laura said quickly. But the college student countered, "She showed you the pass. Why not scan it again?" Laura snapped. "Young man, mind your own business." Phones appeared everywhere. A woman near the window whispered, "Feels like the whole world is watching." Grace adjusted her shawl, her tone regal. "I know when I am being dismissed for appearance, not procedure." "I will not be dismissed today," Laura stiffened. "Out of first class, old lady. If you refuse, I'll involve security." "Do what you must," Grace answered. From her bag, she drew a pocket watch, engraved and gleaming. She checked the time, the gesture quiet yet commanding. Passengers whispered, "Who carries a watch like that? She's not just some old lady." Flustered, Laura snapped her tablet shut. "I'll be back with a supervisor." She marched off toward the galley. The cabin exhaled. "This is ridiculous," the student muttered. The woman in 3C shook her head. "She's handling it better than I could." Grace sat perfectly still, eyes on the clouds. She felt the cameras, the judgment, but her breath stayed steady. She had endured men trying to talk her down in boardrooms, banks that once denied her loans. She had endured, and she knew how to wait. 2 rows back, a businessman leaned to his companion. "You know who that is? Grace Johnson. Johnson Holdings. I read she bought into this airline last year." The words spread like sparks. A few passengers caught them, eyes widening. The whisper wasn't yet a roar, but it grew. The galley door banged open. Laura reemerged with a supervisor. Daniel Harris, Flight Operations. His weary face showed he'd handled too many disputes. "What's the issue?" he asked. Laura gestured at Grace. "This passenger insists she's first class, but our records..." Grace lifted her chin. "My name is Grace Johnson, Seat 2A, first class." Daniel looked at her, then at the boarding pass in Laura's hand. Recognition flickered across his face. A puzzle piece had fallen into place. The cabin went utterly still. Phones recorded. Hearts quickened. Something larger than a seating dispute had taken shape. Grace closed her pocket watch with a soft click. The sound carried through the cabin, louder than Laura's threats, louder than Daniel's sigh. It was the sound of a woman who knew exactly what power she carried and who was preparing to use it. The supervisor, Daniel Harris, lingered in the aisle longer than necessary. Eyes shifting between the boarding pass, Grace Johnson, and the tablet Laura clutched like a shield. Passengers watched the triangle of tension, phones raised. Grace, serene in her deep blue boubou, adjusted her head wrap and let her gaze travel the cabin. 75 years had taught her the weight of silence. Whispers multiplied. "That's definitely her," the businessman in gray murmured. "I saw her at an investment conference in Atlanta, Johnson Holdings Billions." His companion tapped frantically at his phone. "Fortune list. Grace Johnson. Net worth. Wow." Passengers nearby leaned closer, hungry for confirmation. Up front, Laura pressed Daniel. "Sir, our system clearly shows." He silenced her with a raised hand. "I'll need to check with ground control before making adjustments," he said carefully. The college student muttered into his mic. "They don't know who they're dealing with." Grace remained still, only her hands moving as she opened her handbag, withdrew a slim notebook, and began to write. The faint scratch of her pen reached the woman in 3C, sending a shiver down her spine. "She's documenting everything," the husband whispered back. Phones tilted toward her, capturing the regal figure inscribing history in real time. Laura flushed. "You can't just sit there taking notes. You're holding up the flight." Without looking up, Grace replied, "I am noting the time, the names, the words spoken, so there will be no confusion later." The calmness cut sharper than anger. At the back, one attendant whispered, "She's too composed. Feels like she knows exactly how this ends." Then Grace's phone buzzed. She answered quietly, "Yes, I'm delayed. No, don't reschedule the session yet. Tell them I'll join as soon as I'm able." Ordinary words, yet her assured tone sparked new whispers. Sessions? Rescheduling? Who talks like that, steady and in control while accused of stealing a seat? Laura rolled her eyes. "She's pretending. People do this all the time." Daniel's warning glance told a different story. Passengers murmured, "She said session. Board session? She doesn't sound economy." From row 5, a young woman live-streamed. "For everyone just joining, people are saying this is Grace Johnson. If true, this is about to be huge." Her chat exploded, unseen but electric. Grace closed her notebook with a soft snap, tucked it neatly beside her, and looked at Daniel. "I trust you'll verify the documents properly. I'll wait here." The weight in the word trust wasn't lost. Daniel nodded stiffly and hurried down the aisle. Laura exhaled, like command had returned. "You heard him. Prepare to move." Grace tilted her head, silent. "She's not moving," whispered the businessman in gray. "She knows something we don't. It's like a chess game, a teenager breathed. She hasn't touched a piece, but everyone else is already cornered. Phones caught every angle. The student muttered, her calmness is shaking them more than shouting ever could. Grace's pocket watch ticked audibly when she flipped it open again, nodding as though confirming the timeline. Another ripple passed through the rows. She's timing this, someone whispered. Laura tried to reassert control. Passengers, we need order. This woman will be reseated shortly. But her words fell flat. No one supported her. Even the man in the navy blazer, who earlier urged Grace to move, now sat silent, ashamed. Grace raised her eyes at last. Her tone was even, but it landed with weight. Dignity, Miss Bennett, is not negotiable. The line struck like stone in still water. Silence rippled outward. A woman gasped. Someone whispered, "That's a quote people will remember." Laura fumbled with her tablet. You don't make the rules here." But momentum had shifted. Whispers turned to anticipation. Passengers no longer wondered if Grace was important. They wondered how much. The girl live streaming summed it up breathlessly. Something big is about to break. Grace turned back to the window. The Atlantic stretched endless and dark, her reflection steady and deliberate in the glass. The cabin sensed it. This was no misunderstanding over a boarding pass. These were the opening moves of a revelation. The cabin had grown unnaturally still, as though every breath waited for the next move. Grace Johnson sat with her spine straight, notebook in her lap, the ink of fresh notes drying beneath the elastic band. She looked like a grandmother traveling with dignity, yet the atmosphere around her had shifted. She was no longer just a passenger in dispute, she was a storm gathering in silence. Daniel Harris returned from the galley, nervous stiffness in his stride. He glanced at Laura Bennett, who practically vibrated with the urge to reassert control. Then at Grace, who remained immovable. The scent of coffee drifted from the service cart, untouched. "Ms. Johnson," Daniel began carefully, "the gate staff is reviewing your ticketing history. There appears to be some discrepancy." Grace inclined her head. "Discrepancy is a polite word." Laura jumped in, voice sharp. "It's more than a discrepancy. The record says economy." Grace's lips curved faintly. "And yet here I sit," the college student whispered into his mic. "She knows they're wrong." Grace's phone buzzed. This time she answered. "Yes, I'm still delayed. They've asked me to move seats. No, don't worry. I'm documenting everything. Has the board assembled yet?" The word board detonated. Passengers leaned forward, whispering. She said board. Board of what? Grace continued calmly. "Remind them of the agenda: fleet investment, passenger experience, compliance reports. I'll join as soon as I'm able." She ended the call, folded her hands again. Laura tried to laugh. People exaggerate on phone calls. Everyone wants to sound important. But no one echoed her. The businessman in gray whispered, "Fleet investment? Compliance reports?" "She's not pretending." The teenager live streaming mouthed to her viewers. "You heard that? This is viral." Grace turned her eyes to Laura, steel flashing. "You misunderstand, Miss Bennett. I don't exaggerate." Daniel cleared his throat. "Miss Johnson, perhaps if you'd step into the galley, we could resolve this privately." "No," Grace replied. "We will resolve it here. Too many eyes have seen already." She nodded toward the raised phones. "There is no privacy left," passengers murmured. One said, "We're witnesses." Laura snapped. "Fine. We'll call ground security the moment we land." Groans rippled. A woman in 3C shot back. "She showed you her pass. She spoke about a board. Are you pretending she's a stowaway?" The student added, "Why drag her out? Because of her clothes?" Grace opened her notebook, wrote a line, then looked up. Every word you say becomes part of a record larger than this flight." The calmness was thunder. Her phone buzzed again. She answered on speaker. A crisp male voice carried through the cabin. "Madam Johnson, the board is assembled in Conference Hall A. We cannot proceed without you. Are you available to join remotely?" Gasps rippled. "She's Madam Johnson?" someone whispered. Grace spoke evenly. "Put me on the line, Robert. Make sure the minutes reflect the delay is due to the airline's own aircraft." "Yes, ma'am?" The faint murmur of executives filled the speaker. "Grace," another voice older, impatient, cut in. "We've been waiting. The shareholders are restless." The word shareholders crackled through the air. Passengers exchanged looks. "She's not just important," someone muttered. "She's at the top," Grace said. "Begin without me. I will listen. When necessary, I'll intervene." Laura staggered, gripping a seat back. "You can't conduct a board meeting from here." But the evidence was undeniable. Everyone had heard the deference in those voices. The student whispered into his mic. "She's not just fighting for her seat. She's running the show from her seat." After a few more words, Grace ended the call. She looked directly at Laura. "You assumed I did not belong. You assumed my presence was a mistake. Understand this. I belong wherever I choose to be. And this seat," she touched the armrest lightly, "is exactly where I chose." A wave of murmurs coursed through the rows. Daniel swallowed hard. "Ms. Johnson, please accept my apologies. We'll resolve this." But the moment had passed him by. Grace had already shifted the ground. The authority of her call, the recognition of her name, the word shareholders heavy in the air, it was no longer whether she belonged. The only question was how far the consequences would reach. Passengers stared at her, as though seeing her anew. Not just an elegant elder in traditional dress, but a woman commanding a boardroom while seated in 2A. Grace folded her hands once more. "Now," she said softly, though every ear caught it, "let us see who truly has the authority here." The cabin vibrated with tension. The twist had landed. Nothing would be the same again. The first-class cabin no longer felt like a cabin. It felt like a stage. Every glance, every whisper, every faint ding from a phone captured the gravity of what was unfolding. Grace Johnson, 75 years old, draped in her blue and gold boubou, had shifted the atmosphere with a single phone call. The word shareholders still echoed in the minds of those who had heard it. Daniel Harris lingered in the aisle, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights. He had been in operations for nearly 20 years, but this was beyond his training manual. Laura Bennett, the chief flight attendant, looked like she wanted to crawl out of her own skin. Her authority, once sharp as a blade, had dulled in the face of Grace's calm command. Grace did not press her advantage with anger. She simply opened her notebook again and wrote, line after steady line. She paused, only to check her pocket watch, as though timing each step with precision. The silence she carried was heavy, purposeful. Passengers shifted uneasily, whispering. "She's building a case," murmured the woman in 3C. "Feels like every word we hear will end up in some report," her husband added. The college student whispered into his live stream. "She's not here to argue. She's here to trigger the system." At last, Grace looked up. Her gaze fell on Daniel, steady and unblinking. "Mr. Harris, your airline has protocols for incidents of misconduct." "Yes?" Daniel cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am. We do." "Then activate them," Grace said simply. Her tone carried no fire, yet the words struck with precision. Activate them. She wasn't begging for respect. She was invoking the rules of the very institution that sought to diminish her. Daniel shifted his weight, visibly uncomfortable. "I'll need clearance from ground control." "Then request it," Grace replied. He hesitated, but passengers were staring, recording, waiting. Finally, he lifted his radio. and muttered into it, voice low. His words blended with the drone of the engines, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. Laura tried to cut in, desperation creeping into her voice. "Ma'am, you're escalating this unnecessarily. You could have been reseated quietly." Grace's eyes softened, but her words sliced clean. "Escalation was not my choice. Dignity denied is escalation in itself." The sentence landed like a verdict. A man in 4A whispered, "That line, that belongs in a courtroom. Remember, in a present." Around them, the dominoes began to tip. A junior flight attendant hurried forward with a tablet, whispering to Daniel that ground operations was on the line. Daniel listened, nodded, then glanced back at Grace with something approaching respect. "They're reviewing, ma'am. It may take a few minutes." Grace leaned back, folding her hands over her notebook. "Then we will wait. Orderly. Documented. Transparent." Phones captured her every movement, every syllable. She was no longer just defending her right to a seat. She was modeling how systems bend when pressed with precision. The live-streaming teenager murmured to her viewers, "She's not shouting. She's not crying. She's pulling strings we can't even see." Passengers nodded, their unease slowly shifting into awe. Even those who had doubted her earlier now sat straighter, glancing at Grace as though witnessing something historic. Laura stood frozen, her authority shrinking with every recorded second. She opened her mouth, but no words came. The cabin was no longer hers to control. And in that suspended moment, Grace writing Daniel on the radio, passengers recording it, became clear that this wasn't about one woman's seat anymore. It was about a system forced to acknowledge its own weight, its own bias, and the stakes of ignoring both. Grace checked her watch again, closed it with a soft click, and whispered just loud enough for the nearest rows to hear. "Every system yields when reminded who holds the balance." The cabin went silent once more, knowing the next move would shake more than this flight. The minutes stretched long, each second thick with tension. Daniel Harris still gripped his radio, murmuring clipped updates to ground operations. His face betrayed the tug-of-war happening in his mind. Duty to the airline versus the undeniable presence of the woman in seat 2A. Grace Johnson sat unmoved. Her blue and gold boubou gleamed under the cabin lights, her notebook balanced neatly on her lap. She tapped the end of her pen softly against the page, as though marking beats in a score only she could hear. Each tap was deliberate, like the tick of a metronome counting down to an inevitable shift. Whispers spread in hushed, urgent tones. "Ground control is on the line. They're hesitating. Something's going on beyond this cabin." The college student live streaming kept whispering into his phone. "Viewers, I swear, it feels like corporate headquarters is watching this right now. Like every move here is rippling outward." Passengers noticed subtle shifts. The junior flight attendant who had first assisted Daniel now avoided Laura Bennett altogether, choosing instead to hover near Grace's row. Her eyes darted nervously but held a flicker of respect when they landed on the older woman. The businessman in gray typed furiously into his phone. He wasn't scrolling social feeds, he was digging, cross-referencing, searching. Suddenly he froze, his screen glowing faintly in the dimmed cabin. His whisper cut sharp. "It's true. She's listed as a major stakeholder. Johnson Holdings, top investor, last fiscal year." Gasps rose, low, and startled. The whisper shot down the aisle like an electric current. Laura's head jerked around. "What did you just say?" The businessman's eyes met hers, unflinching. "She doesn't just fly with this airline. She owns part of it." The words fell heavy. Even the hum of the engines seemed to pause. Phones tilted instantly toward Grace, capturing her stillness as though the cameras themselves knew history was unfolding. Laura stammered, "That's ridiculous. If that were true, we would know." Grace lifted her head, meeting Laura's gaze with serene finality. You didn't know because you didn't look. You assumed. The blow landed clean. The passenger's expression shifted not just curiosity now, but recognition. They weren't watching a dispute anymore. They were watching truth pierce through arrogance. Daniel's radio crackled. He pressed it to his ear, his shoulders stiffening. Yes, sir. Yes, I understand. His eyes darted toward Grace. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Yes, she's still on board. He lowered the radio, his face pale. For the first time, Daniel addressed Grace with formality. Madam Johnson, headquarters requests confirmation of your documentation. They're aware of the situation. The phrase headquarters is aware sent a ripple down the aisle. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed stares. The live streamer whispered, "There it is. The system knows." She's not bluffing. Grace opened her notebook once more and wrote a single line, her pen steady. Then she looked up. Good. Awareness is the first step to accountability. The woman in 3C clutched her husband's arm. She's changing everything, right here, in real time. Laura tried to salvage control, her voice trembling. Even if she's important, she was disruptive. Grace's calm voice sliced through. Disruption is when truth refuses to stay hidden. Her words struck harder than any accusation. Passengers murmured agreement, their voices rising like a chorus. For the first time, Laura's isolation was visible. Where once she had wielded authority, now every eye regarded her with suspicion. Daniel shifted again, his tone gentler now. Ms. Johnson, would you allow us to verify your ID with headquarters directly? Grace extended her boarding pass and her ID card, the movements measured, regal. Verify what should have been verified from the beginning. He took them with reverent care, as though holding evidence in a trial. Passengers craned their necks, recording, whispering. The dominoes had started to fall. Each action, each line spoken, tipped another piece of the system toward revelation. And in the quiet that followed, it was clear to everyone. Grace Johnson wasn't just defending her dignity. She was pulling the strings of an entire institution, and the strings were beginning to tighten. The air grew heavier still. Something larger was on the verge of breaking. The cabin vibrated with tension, though the engines purred steadily beneath it all. Grace Johnson remained in her seat, notebook balanced on her lap, pocket watch resting beside her pen. Every so often she glanced at the watch, as if counting down to an unseen clock. Each motion was deliberate, every breath under control. Daniel Harris stood a few feet away, radio still in his hand, his knuckles pale. He looked toward the galley where crew whispered in a nervous huddle. His voice was low, almost reverent when he finally spoke. Headquarters confirmed your identity, Madam Johnson. They're preparing a statement. Gasps echoed across the rows. The businessman in gray leaned back with a sharp nod, murmuring to no one in particular, "It's real, all of it." The young live streamer clutched her phone, eyes wide. Into her camera she whispered, "Everyone watching, this is history." They admitted it. She's not just a passenger, she's their boss. Laura Bennett's face drained of color. "This can't be right," she muttered, shaking her head. "It can't." Grace finally lifted her gaze, fixing Laura with calm precision. The truth rarely asks permission to be right. The line cut deeper than any reprimand. A murmur of agreement rolled through the cabin, passengers shifting in their seats, as though aligning themselves closer to Grace's authority. Daniel cleared his throat. "Ma'am, would you like to continue this discussion privately?" "No," Grace said. Her voice was soft, yet the firmness in it froze him mid-step. "This began in public. It will be resolved in public. Transparency is no longer optional." Her words resonated with the crowd. A passenger whispered, "She's turning this flight into a courtroom." Another answered, "No." Into a boardroom. Phones caught every angle, the boubou's shimmer, the silver in Grace's curls, Laura's clenched jaw, Daniel's uneasy posture. Grace closed her notebook with a snap. The sound seemed to reverberate louder than the engines. She slipped the elastic band into place and set the notebook on the tray table, her hand resting on its cover. "I have given your airline ample time to correct itself," she said. "Instead, I was met with dismissal, mockery, and doubt." Her eyes swept the cabin, catching each lens, each witness. "Let us be clear. That era ends tonight." The declaration struck like a hammer. Passengers broke into scattered applause, some timid, some bold. The energy shifted, no longer tense silence, but an undercurrent of defiance directed at Laura, at the faceless system behind her. Laura's voice cracked. "You don't get to make declarations here. You're just—" She stopped herself, the word passenger dying on her tongue. She knew better now. Everyone did. Grace leaned forward slightly, her presence filling the space. "From this moment," she said, each syllable deliberate, "I am the one issuing directives on this aircraft." The line landed like thunder. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The authority in her tone was undeniable, the weight of her name already confirmed. The businessman whispered fiercely, "Did you hear that? She's taking command." The teenage live streamer repeated it into her phone, her voice trembling with awe. She just said she's the one giving orders now. This is the turning point. Even Daniel, seasoned and cautious, lowered his eyes slightly, as though acknowledging a shift he could no longer resist. Grace picked up her pocket watch, snapped it shut with a decisive click, and placed it back in her bag. The gesture was final, the countdown complete. Every passenger felt it, the moment before impact. The system had been cornered. The reveal was inevitable. And as silence reclaimed the cabin, Grace's words hung heavy in the air, a quiet promise that the next chapter would change everything. The silence in the first-class cabin was electric. Every passenger could feel the air thick with suspense, as if the aircraft itself were holding its breath. Grace Johnson sat upright in seat 2A, her boubou glowing faintly under the overhead lights, the gold embroidery catching and reflecting the shimmer of a stage spotlight. She rested her notebook on the tray table, one hand still touching its cover, the other slowly reaching into her leather handbag. Laura Bennett's voice cracked the hush. "You can't just announce yourself as the one giving orders. That isn't how any of this works." Grace looked at her, eyes calm, but unyielding. "Then allow me to remind you of how it does work." Her fingers closed around a slim black folder inside her bag. She drew it out with unhurried care, placing it on the tray. Passengers leaned forward as if they were witnesses to some sacred unveiling. Grace opened the folder. Inside were a handful of crisp documents, contracts, printed agreements, embossed with seals that gleamed under the cabin light. Daniel Harris took a step closer, his radio dangling forgotten at his side. "Madam Johnson, what are those?" "The papers you never thought to imagine a woman like me might carry," Grace said. She slid the top sheet toward him with her fingertips. "Ownership documents. Johnson Holdings share acquisition in this very airline. Filed, notarized, and public. But apparently hidden in plain sight from those who prefer to judge passengers by their attire." Gasps echoed around the cabin. A woman clutched her chest. A man muttered, "She brought the receipts." Daniel bent low, scanning the paper. His lips moved as he read. "Acquisition of 34% stake. Majority voting rights secured through proxy agreements. Board seat guaranteed under Clause 12. He straightened, visibly shaken. This is binding." Grace's voice sharpened. though it remained steady. Indeed. Clause 12, subsection 3. In matters of shareholder dispute, impacting brand integrity, the board representative may act with direct authority. That representative is me. Laura's jaw fell open. This is insane. No passenger, no woman sitting in 2A should have this kind of... She faltered, the words refusing to come, because the evidence lay inches away from her. Grace closed the folder with a quiet snap. It is not insane, Miss Bennett. It is ownership. The line rang like a gavel. Phones trembled in passengers' hands as they caught the moment. The college student whispered into his live stream. She literally pulled out ownership papers. She's not bluffing. She is the airline. Laura took a step back, her earlier confidence draining from her face. So what now? You want to humiliate me? Fire me here in front of everyone? Grace regarded her evenly, her silver curls gleaming in the light. No, humiliation serves no one. Accountability, however, serves everyone. She looked around the cabin, her voice carrying with quiet authority. The issue is not one woman's arrogance. The issue is a system that emboldens arrogance at the expense of dignity. A murmur of agreement rolled through the rows. The woman in 3C whispered to her husband, "She's not just proving herself. She's making this about all of us." Daniel's phone buzzed. He lifted it, his face paling as he listened. "Headquarters confirms," he said finally, voice unsteady. They said, "Madam Johnson holds the controlling stake." Passengers erupted in whispers, some gasping aloud, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The live-streaming teenager whispered, breathlessly, "Confirmed. Official. She's the top shareholder. It's all real." Grace gathered the documents back into her folder and slid it into her handbag. "I did not come here tonight to wield these papers like a sword. But when dignity is denied, evidence must be revealed." Her words sank deep into the silence. Even Laura, trembling now, could find no retort. Grace folded her hands, looking at Daniel. "You will inform headquarters that their representative has exercised Clause 12. Effective immediately, I assume authority for decisions related to this flight's integrity." Daniel's voice was barely audible. "Yes, Madam Johnson." The shift was complete. Authority had migrated from the airline's uniform to the calm figure in traditional African dress, seated in 2A. Passengers applauded softly at first, then louder, building into a rhythm that filled the cabin. They weren't just clapping for a seat. They were clapping for vindication, for every quiet injustice that had gone unanswered. Grace inclined her head slightly, acknowledging their support, but her face remained calm, almost solemn. This wasn't triumph, it was duty. She looked once more at Laura, her tone firm but not cruel. "You mistook tradition for inferiority. You mistook age for weakness. You mistook appearance for irrelevance. Mistakes can be forgiven, Miss Bennett, but only if they are admitted." Laura's lips trembled, her eyes darting to the passengers, to the phones capturing her every move. She said nothing. Grace turned her gaze forward, back toward the clouds stretching endless outside the window. "Tonight we reset more than a seat assignment. Tonight we reset perception." The applause swelled again, stronger this time, as if the cabin itself had joined in. And somewhere in the hum of the engines, the sound of old power giving way to new dignity could almost be heard. The folder was back in Grace Johnson's handbag, but the echo of its contents lingered like thunder after lightning. The passengers knew. The crew knew. Headquarters knew. The question wasn't if the system would change, it was how fast. Daniel Harris held his radio like a lifeline. His face was pale, eyes darting between Grace and the cabin crew still huddled by the galley. Finally, his voice broke through the silence. "Madam Johnson, what are your instructions?" The words sent a visible shiver through the cabin. The authority had shifted, irreversibly. Grace leaned forward slightly, folding her hands on the tray table. Her voice was calm, measured, but carried the weight of command. Begin with transparency. Issue an internal alert to all crew on this aircraft. The passenger dispute has been resolved under shareholder authority. Effective immediately. Dignity and compliance are non-negotiable. Daniel relayed the words into his radio. His tone carried none of his earlier reluctance. It was obedience. Now. Within seconds, the junior flight attendant straightened, glancing at Grace as if awaiting further guidance. Laura Bennett stood stiff near the aisle, her mouth open but silent. She looked like someone who had just watched the ground collapse beneath her feet. Grace continued, her gaze steady. Second, you will open a channel to headquarters. Inform them that Clause 12 has been activated. A cultural review task force will be convened within 48 hours, with board-level oversight. This flight will be cited as the trigger. Passengers gasped. Someone whispered, "She's reforming the airline from row 2. Daniel repeated the words into the radio. The reply crackled back audibly. "Understood, Madam Johnson." Headquarters acknowledges. The cabin erupted in murmurs. Phones recorded feverishly. The live streamer whispered, "She just ordered a corporate task force while sitting in first class. This is unreal." Grace wasn't finished. She picked up her notebook, flipped to a fresh page, and began writing. Each line she spoke as she wrote, her pen scratching steadily. Third, passengers who witnessed this incident will be contacted for statements. Their accounts will be preserved as evidence, not dismissed as inconvenience. Accountability will not disappear into silence. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then stronger. Several passengers nodded, their faces lit with a sense of vindication. Laura shook her head, muttering, "This isn't how airlines operate. This isn't protocol." Grace looked at her, her voice soft but sharp. "Protocol exists to serve justice, not bury it. When protocol fails, reset the system." Laura fell silent, eyes dropping to the carpet. The dominoes fell, one by one. A junior flight attendant approached Grace with cautious respect. "Madam Johnson, would you like to address the cabin officially?" Grace closed her notebook, slipped the elastic band over it, and stood slowly. Her presence filled the aisle. Her silver curls gleamed under the cabin lights, her boubou shimmering with each movement. She turned to face the rows of passengers, dozens of cameras raised toward her. "You have all witnessed how dignity can be denied," she said, voice strong yet steady. "And you have also witnessed how truth reclaims its place. Tonight, this aircraft became more than a vessel across the Atlantic. It became a mirror, reflecting what must change. Not tomorrow. Not someday. Tonight." The cabin thundered with applause, hands clapping, voices cheering. Some passengers rose from their seats. Their support no longer whispered, but declared. Grace lifted one hand, calming the noise. "Let this be the first reset, not the last. Systems change only when the people within them demand it. Tonight, we demand it." Her words hung in the air like a verdict. Daniel lowered his radio, his face a mixture of awe and resignation. "Orders received, Madam Johnson," he said softly. The system had bowed. The reset had begun. The plane sped through the night sky, but inside the cabin, it felt like a headquarters had suddenly materialized. Grace Johnson's declaration had reached the ground, and now the airline's highest office scrambled to catch up. Daniel Harris pressed his radio close, his voice brisk, reporting Grace's directives. Within minutes, his earpiece crackled again. This time, the urgency was unmistakable. "Headquarters requests immediate teleconference. Emergency session. All senior flight staff present." He looked at Grace. "Madam Johnson, they're assembling now." Grace gave a single nod. "Then let us not delay." The forward galley was transformed in moments. A tablet mounted to the bulkhead screen flickered alive, revealing faces in tidy corporate frames. Directors, executives, legal counsel. Their voices overlapped at first, tense, defensive. How did this reach the cabin? Social media is already flooding with footage. We need containment before the stock takes a hit. Grace's voice cut clean through their panic. Containment. What you need is reform. You are not losing control because of a video. You are losing control because of arrogance that has gone unchecked. Silence fell on the feed. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. She continued, measured but fierce. This incident is not isolated. It is the symptom of a deeper illness, one that disrespects culture, age, and dignity. Tonight, you will agree to a cultural reform program. Emergency adoption. No delay. The chief legal officer adjusted his glasses. Such initiatives require board review. Grace interrupted, her tone precise. Clause 12 has been invoked. Board review is already underway by me. Passengers in the cabin, able to see the tablet from their seats, gasped softly. The live streamer whispered, "She's taking them to task." Live. This is insane. Grace opened her notebook and read aloud from the page she had just written. Effective immediately. 1. A task force on cultural respect, chaired by external advisors, reporting directly to the board. 2. Mandatory retraining for all frontline staff within 60 days. 3. Public acknowledgement of this incident, not a cover-up, issued within 24 hours. Her pen tapped the notebook once, punctuating the list. Vote now. On the screen, executives glanced at one another, their hesitation visible, but slowly, one by one, hands raised. The chair of the board sighed heavily, then lifted hers. Motion passed. The passengers erupted in applause. Even Daniel's shoulders sagged in relief. Laura stood frozen, staring at the floor, as though the ground itself had vanished beneath her feet. Grace closed her notebook. Then let this be written in the record. Reform begins not in comfort, but in crisis. And tonight, we have chosen to begin. Her words sealed the moment. The emergency reform was no longer a discussion, it was law. By the time the aircraft landed, the story had already escaped the cabin. The live stream from Row 5 had spread across continents, bouncing from one news site to another, plastered on timelines and evening broadcasts. Grace Johnson, 75 years old, in her gold-trimmed boubou, had become a symbol overnight. Morning anchors debated with urgency. An airline shareholder confronting her own staff. A cultural reckoning at 30,000 feet. Viewers shook their heads, not at the turbulence of the skies, but at the turbulence of injustice, laid bare. At airports from Atlanta to Nairobi, passengers shared the footage while waiting at their gates. Strangers nodded knowingly, whispering, "That could have been me. That could have been my mother." In living rooms, grandmothers leaned closer to their screens, their eyes shining with recognition. Other airlines felt the tremor next. In press rooms across the industry, executives huddled nervously. A rival CEO admitted on camera, "We are reviewing our own practices. No company is immune to this moment." Stock analysts called it the Johnson effect. Grace herself remained quiet, issuing no flamboyant statements, only confirming that reforms had begun. But her silence was not retreat, it was gravity. Every network filled the space with her image. Seated calmly, silver curls, under a regal wrap, her notebook resting on the tray, as if justice itself had been drafted there. Communities responded with force. Social groups formed online under banners of dignity and equity. Former flight attendants shared stories they had once buried. Civil rights leaders praised Grace as a living example of how power, when wielded without anger yet with precision, could bend systems in real time. One evening, A television anchor replayed the pivotal moment, Grace closing her folder of ownership documents and declaring, "It is not insane, it is ownership." The line was repeated in editorials, on posters, and in speeches. Students at a historically black college chanted it at a rally, their voices carrying across a campus quad. Meanwhile, inside the airline, dominoes continued to fall. The task force on cultural respect convened immediately. Uniform designers sketched proposals that reflected global traditions. Training modules were rewritten with urgency. Staff whispered about the old days ending, a new standard beginning. For passengers who had witnessed it firsthand, the story followed them home. At dinner tables, they described how calm had defeated arrogance, how a woman nearly dismissed as irrelevant had revealed herself as the architect of the very company in dispute. Each retelling carried awe, as though they had seen history in a narrow aisle between leather seats. And still, beyond the headlines and the meetings, the ripple widened. Not just in boardrooms, not just in terminals, but in ordinary hearts. The lesson whispered again and again, dignity denied to one is a wound to all. Grace Johnson had not shouted. She had not stormed. She had simply stood her ground, and the world moved with her. Months after that night above the Atlantic, the airline no longer looked the same. Passengers boarding in Accra were greeted by attendants in uniforms inspired by West African textiles. Rich patterns, bold colors, woven with respect. In Tokyo, kimonos influenced the subtle folds of the jackets. In Mexico City, embroidery traced the cuffs in homage to local craft. Each month, a different culture was honored. Each flight became a celebration of diversity, visible proof that reform had taken root. The Cultural Reform Program was more than fabric and color. Training manuals now began with a simple creed. Every passenger carries dignity on board. Respect is not optional. The phrase hung in every crew lounge, etched onto polished plaques. New recruits recited it during orientation, as if it were a vow. Passengers noticed. Stories multiplied of attendants offering warmth beyond the scripted smile. An elderly woman in Chicago, traveling alone for the first time in years, was ushered to her seat with gentle care and whispered, "We're honored you're here." A father in Johannesburg described how the crew admired his daughter's braided hair, calling it beautiful, not different. The ripple Grace Johnson had set in motion had hardened into a new foundation. Other airlines followed suit, adopting programs of their own. News outlets spoke of an industry turned on its head by one woman's quiet defiance. Grace herself remained modest. She gave few interviews, preferring to let the reforms speak louder than her name. Yet when asked why she had revealed her ownership that night, her answer was always the same. Power is a tool. Dignity is the purpose. I use the first to secure the second. Her words became a quote etched on posters, shared across social feeds, even engraved into the company's annual report. At graduations and community gatherings, leaders invoked her story as proof that age does not dim authority, nor does tradition weaken strength. In church halls across the South, elders told the tale with reverence, their voices rising with pride. How a 75-year-old woman in a gold-trimmed boubou had humbled an entire airline and rebuilt it in the image of respect. Younger listeners leaned forward, eyes bright, hearing not just a story of an airline, but a story of themselves, what dignity defended could achieve. And so, Grace Johnson's legacy was secured, not in wealth or contracts, but in the daily gestures of respect that rippled outward. Every bow, every smile, every careful greeting on flights around the world carried her imprint. On a quiet afternoon, watching a plane ascend into the sky, Grace closed her pocket watch with a soft click. She whispered to herself, not for applause, not for cameras. The system remembered. What we have just shared isn't only about an airline seat or a corporate contract. It's about the truth that dignity has no age limit, no cultural border, and no expiration date. Grace Johnson showed us that calm courage can dismantle arrogance, and that ownership of self is as powerful as ownership of shares. For me, the most moving part of the story is how she never raised her voice, never lost her composure, yet she still forced an entire system to change. That's a lesson I think we all can carry into our daily lives. When you know your worth, you don't need to shout. You only need to stand firm. If this story touched you, let it be a spark. Share it with someone who needs reminding that injustice can be challenged, that silence can be broken, and that legacy can be secured at any age. Please leave your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear how this story speaks to your own experiences. And don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story that matters.